Hello and welcome to Godless Bitches Season 5, Episode 9. Today is Saturday, May 4th, 2019, and I'm Tracie Harris. With me today is our regular host, Jen Peeples.
Hey, how are you?
And our very special guest from the Texas Freedom Network, Carisa Lopez.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it. Godless Bitches is a production of the Atheist Community of Austin, a Texas nonprofit educational organization dedicated to separation of religion and government and the promotion of positive atheist culture. We don't have any real announcements today. We do have, Clare is out. She had a conflict, so she won't be with us today, unfortunately. But like I say, we do have Carisa, who agreed to come in and not just fill in, but she came in whether Clare was going to be here or not, because we have stuff to talk about. So Carisa, you are with Texas Freedom Network, which is a group here in Texas that shares a lot of the goals of the Atheist Community of Austin, because part of our mission statement is separation of church and state. Or like we like to say, I guess religion and government now covers more because church is kind of a Christian affiliation.
Right.
But we really just try to keep a secular government, basically, and let people have religious freedom by keeping government out of the churches, out of the religious realm, and keeping religion out of the government helps to ensure that for people. And so we have asked you on to come in today and talk to us about some of the legislation that's been happening that's a concern for us and for your group as well, and some of the things that you're watching and some of the things that you're doing to respond to some of that legislation. So please feel free to tell us a little bit more about Texas Freedom Network and your mission and your role in that group.
Yeah, so I'm the political director over at TFN, so I'm completely immersed in legislative session right now, and there's a lot going on. And TFN's mission is to fight for religious freedom, civil liberties, separation of church and state in all areas. We organize on college campuses, but we do also do a lot of organizing within faith communities because, you know, when we think of the Christianity, we don't believe that the far right gets to own that.
Right.
That the far right, like there are plenty of progressive clergy members, and also, you know, we have so many religions in this country that one type of religion shouldn't get to dictate public policy, which is why we have separation of church and state.
Just to interject here, we did have a guest on just a few episodes back who was one of the pastors in the Methodist Church who opposed the anti-gay vote, right? So he is supportive of the gay community. Right. He's one of the churches that is supporting that and wanted to speak out about that. So we had him on as a guest.
Great.
And also, I find it interesting. It's kind of interesting. You know, I did speak to you before the show and talk about how, you know, we can't really get too political and we definitely don't endorse candidates. But one of the candidates that's kind of bringing this religious narrative to the front is Buttigieg, right? Who's like kind of pushing back on that right-wing religious ownership of that narrative.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly, what we strive for is that, you know, the reason we have separation of church and state is because, you know, you shouldn't have to practice one brand of Christianity. You should be able to also not practice any religion at all. Right. If you are Islam, if you are Jewish, if you are any of the other, you know, small minority religions in this country, you should have the freedom to practice or not practice without having the interference of government.
Yeah.
We are seeing a national attempt to create this narrative that there is an attack on Christianity, which is not actually true.
Right.
And as a result, though, we are seeing legislation pop up across the country to protect a certain brand of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, one of the things that the far Christian right, they've created this attack on Christianity, and all it is in reality is just people pushing back on their excesses, you know, their insistence on shoving this in everybody else's face.
That's right.
Yeah, and it ends up, I mean, it's sort of disturbing to me that it results in this very political debate that happens in front of the nation between, you know, a Democratic candidate and a vice president, basically arguing about, you know, religious correctness or doctrinal correctness in a realm where this shouldn't even matter.
Right. Well, and they try to say, the religious right tries to say that, it's not discrimination. We're just trying to exercise our freedom of religion, but their freedom of religion
Right, it's not mutually exclusive.
Right, and you know what? You are allowed if you want to. I don't agree with it, but the government does not interfere if you are discriminating within your church or your thoughts. But when that comes into the public sphere, that's where we have a problem, and that's why we have separation of church and state.
Yeah.
We're seeing at the Texas Capitol, we're seeing across the country, there's something called Project Blitz. I'm not sure if you've heard of this.
Is it going to scare me?
It might.
Okay.
It is a national playbook from the religious right on how to pass and model legislation for far-right Christianity. That comes from Bible classes in public schools. That comes from religious exemption laws, meaning that, you can allowing people to discriminate based on a sincerely held religious belief that isn't defined. And it's a playbook that we've seen that's been shopped around to various state legislatures. And we've seen a lot of that legislation introduced in the state of Texas this session.
It's interesting because it seems like there's other groups like the anti-vax movement that have used similar playbooks saying, hey, if you have these sincerely held personal or religious beliefs, you're now exempt from vaccinations. And we see that on multiple levels, this causes direct harm to the public.
Yeah.
I mean, my sincerely held religious beliefs shouldn't have any impact on you or anyone else.
Right. That's exactly right. And we've seen, a lot of these laws also equate to allowing federal or county or city employees to be able to discriminate. And when you are taking state funds, we saw it last session, we're seeing it this session, especially since we finally have marriage equality. And so they are looking to see how they can continue to just chip away at LGBTQ rights.
Right.
And this is how they're doing it.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of ironic to me that people would use legislation to try to ensure a right to discriminate even as they're working and operating with the public, and also if they're taking state funding. And then the state would be promoting legislation that says that you can't discriminate by boycotting Israeli products.
Yeah.
If you're taking state.
If you try, sometimes in order to maintain my sanity, I have to just not make the hypocrisy argument because they don't care, right? They don't care that they're being hypocrites. They don't care that, for example, these religious exemption laws have lots of unintended consequences. We saw this in, I think it was South Carolina, where they have similar laws. They received a federal waiver to be able to discriminate based on a sincerely held religious belief, a certain adoption agency. We saw a Jewish couple, we saw a Catholic couple because they weren't the right kind of Christian discriminated against. And that's, these laws are targeted specifically for the most part towards discrimination of the LGBTQ community, but they are far-reaching, they are broad, and they have so many unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think Alabama right now, because they're so incensed about gay people getting married, they're actually trying to ban marriage licenses in Alabama. So
That's an interesting.
Yeah, you would basically just register your marriage with the local officials, but you wouldn't get a marriage license anymore.
Yeah,
so
we've seen
it's a very bizarre.
We just had there was a public hearing this past Wednesday on a bill that would have allowed city and county and government employees to exempt themselves based on a sincerely held religious belief for performing marriages. That freedom already exists for clergy within their churches,
right.
And their congregations.
And that's another thing that they do, right?
So we have freedom of religion already.
Right. They have this thing, right, where they take these issues that are either already decided or not a problem and nobody's doing it.
Right.
And then they pass legislation about it in order to try and make it look like an issue. Right. Like they'll say, oh, they're doing this or that with regard to abortion, and we need to pass this law to stop this. And it's like, no one's doing this.
No. Right. So much for small government. They try to solve problems that don't exist because it fits into their narrative.
Well, it's almost like saying, we have to, like we have to stop all these, Hispanic rapes, like just to kind of shit,
Right.
because there's this narrative now that's going on about like the criminal Hispanic population, right, that we're hearing over and over, this fear mongering.
Right.
And if you started passing legislation against like, making, it's like you're sort of, it's just a way to amp up the fear.
That's right.
Using legislation to make it public and make it, to promote this in a way that's very, very visible, even though it's not happening. People hear, oh my gosh, they had to pass a law to stop this from happening, and it makes you think this was happening.
Right. When you, as a public official, you have a duty to tell the truth, to report to your constituents, and that your constituents, for the most part, trust that because you are in a position of immense power, that you are going to do what's in their best interest. But that has not been the case for a lot of officials, right? They have no problem lying and fear mongering, and as a result, we see more and more policies being passed based on lying and fear mongering.
Yeah, well, like that, like the Muslim ban, right? That's another one. So it's like they push the criminality of like immigrants, which is just a complete lie.
Right.
And then they push the the terrorist threat from particular countries, which it's not a problem. I mean, the people coming in are trying to get away from those situations. And so they promote these things as if it's like, oh, we have to protect ourselves from these things, but it's things that we don't need to protect ourselves from. It's actually, these are other people that would like to be protected from a situation where they're trying to escape all kinds of weird, Muslim oppression that's happening in their own country, or wars or corruption that's happening, in somewhere in Central or South America.
Right.
And they're trying to come here because they don't want the same problems that we're sitting here claiming they're bringing with them. And it's like, no, they're coming here to get away from those problems. And we should be working with them because we have a common goal of not wanting those problems.
And statistically speaking, immigrants commit crimes at lower
Right,
levels.
absolutely. And we've talked about that on this
Nobody's
show.
perfect. I mean, you're never, but if you look at just the facts, but the problem is that there is the refusal and the denial of facts that we're facing now, right?
And not only that, but we've made the point several times that sanctuary cities are, statistically speaking, safer than cities that are not sanctuary cities. And part of that is that within sanctuary cities, immigrants, whether they have documentation or not, are less afraid to go to the police and report crimes and to be a witness. And
we see law enforcement saying that as well in certain cities,
law enforcement is
right?
completely on board with this. And so, I mean, this is something that's completely uncontroversial. Unless you're a far-right, Christian or whatever, and you need to have, the bad guys to point at and say, all your problems
there always has to be somebody to blame, right? Throughout history, there's always been somebody to blame. And right now, we're blaming everything on immigrants, particularly Latin American immigrants.
And it's so bad that, so my in-laws live up in Wisconsin, okay? And we got a call a couple of weeks ago from my mother-in-law, and she's like, so I hear so much about all this stuff at the border and everything. So how bad is it down there? And we're like, it's like not. This is completely manufactured. There's literally no problem.
We have really great food here, though.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was like, no, the problem that we have is a manufactured humanitarian crisis because they are shutting down the border, the legal entry points.
Yeah.
They're
funneling. They're squeezing the funnel down. They're not applying the right type of resource, right? They're applying this law enforcement brand of resource instead of resources that can actually process people, which would totally be helpful if we could get more people through the system in a way that wasn't just, okay, let's try to keep them out, and then if they do get in, let's figure out how to export them. It's like, that's not a process, right? That's really backward. This isn't how it's supposed to be working.
Right. The system does not work. It's just not working.
But you're talking about this Blitz-ish situation, and I'm assuming that's why we're seeing a whole lot of similar legislation coming out of a whole lot of states running right toward the Supreme Court.
That's exactly right. We are in Texas, because elections matter, there's a big divide on in the Texas House and the Texas Senate on some of these far-right anti-LGBTQ laws.
Sure.
The lieutenant governor is still not, he just can't help himself. I think he tried for the first few weeks of session to get it together because he knew that that this was not popular legislation, and because that's what voters told them by the election results.
Yeah.
But he couldn't help himself. He and made Senate Bill 17. You know, in the House and Senate, the first 30 bills or bill numbers like SB or HB 1 through 30 are priority legislation for the Speaker of the House and Lieutenant Governor and the Governor.
Yeah.
So those are reserved. So if you see something with a low bill number, you know it's a priority for that chamber.
Okay.
So SB 17. It's a low bill number.
Right.
It's a very bad religious exemption law that they skyrocketed through the Senate. It basically says if you have an occupational license from the state of Texas, you can discriminate based on a sincerely held religious belief. That could be a plumber, that could be a healthcare worker, that could be a cosmetologist, right? It could be a counselor, a teacher. So that's very problematic legislation.
I have a
yeah,
question.
sure.
Some of the exemptions for the licensing were weird to me. So, like police.
They wanted to make sure that was their attempt to say that, you know, if it's a life-threatening situation, they're not allowed to discriminate. So there was a law enforcement.
So what if you're a pharmacist?
Right. No, that's exactly right.
And I need my insulin and, you know.
Well, or you need your HIV medication, or you need
Plan B.
Yeah, exactly. Plan B. Then yes, you would be able to discriminate based on a sincerely held religious belief. That bill is stalled on the House sides as of yet, but on the Senate, you know, on the floor we had some of our friendly members. The author tried to say, no, this is not discrimination against the LGBTQ community. This is just protecting the religious beliefs of a person, an individual sincerely held religious belief. So we had amendments offered. They offered amendments that says, okay, if that's not the case, then will you put an amendment in there that would say that you are not allowed to discriminate based on a sexual orientation or a gender identity? Of course, it got shot down.
Right.
So it's very obvious what they are trying to do on these bills.
Well, and it has even broader implications. I was reading a story just this week about a woman who went to a pharmacist. It was not in Texas, but it was somewhere else that has a similar law that allows pharmacists to refuse to fill prescriptions.
Right.
This woman, she was having a miscarriage. Basically, the fetus was dead.
Right.
And she needed a drug to help her expel the pregnancy, right? And so she goes to the pharmacist. This is a drug that's often used to cause an early-term medication abortion.
Right.
Okay.
The safest kind.
Yes, absolutely, the safest kind. And the pharmacist refused to fill the prescription. And she's like, look, I need this drug. I'm at risk of getting an infection if I don't complete this miscarriage. It's done. There's no baby. Okay.
Right.
And the pharmacist refused to fill the prescription. And he's like, well, I can call or I can send the prescription to this other pharmacy, but there's no guarantee someone there will fill it. Or you can come back tomorrow and get it. And meanwhile, the clock is ticking on her. You know, she needs to complete this miscarriage.
This reminds me of a question that I've had before. I've seen different cases, decided in different ways, right? So sometimes the cases are decided and it says that a chain pharmacy can accommodate the religious requirement as long as they have another pharmacist on duty who will fill the prescription. So in other words, this pharmacist won't do it, but this other one is here, and they will. And that applies to pharmacies where they generally employ more than one person on a shift. Of course, a smaller pharmacy isn't going to have that option. And so what I've also seen done is what Jen just described. They have to then transfer it to another local pharmacy. So my question becomes, this reminds me of the disability laws around like reasonable accommodation. But what reasonable accommodation literally means that when the accommodation hits a point where it's not reasonable, you no longer have to accommodate, right? It's like if I can't do it, if the person just cannot fulfill the job and I have no other way to do this, then I can discriminate based on the disability according to the law. I'm not judging whether that's right or not. But according to that sort of philosophy, it would seem that if we started to get a glut of pharmacies where no one could get their drugs, that we would have to retract the religious protection to say, well, you can't have that anymore because we can't get the jobs done.
Yeah.
Is that your understanding of the philosophy that they're using? Would it make a difference if we started seeing like all the pharmacies doing this or all the hospitals refusing to deal with, reproductive things, or you know what I mean?
It might. I mean, that's going to be one. I'm not a lawyer, but I would assume that if it became a really widespread, then we would definitely see an attempt to deal with the problem, but that could be a variety. That could mean a variety of things, right?
Right.
But we also see that when they're passing this legislation, that's what they say, but that somebody else can just do it. But I mean, Texas, we have a lot of urban centers, so we have so much rural as well. We're talking with some of the social workers, and they say we have a shortage of counselors even in the urban centers, and in our rural areas, we really have a shortage. So if, for example, you would be able to, if you are a school counselor or a social worker working at a hospital and you live in, I don't know, Abilene, which is, which is it's a small town. It's one of the, I guess, bigger small towns, but there's probably only one hospital there, a handful of social workers on call at any moment in time. What are you going to do? And if you have somebody who is suicidal and they're LGBTQ, having that rejection and that crucial moment can literally mean life or death for a person.
Yeah. Or like you're saying, a school counselor. You might be the only counselor at that school.
Right.
And so what does the student do?
Right.
Yeah, it's a mess.
So it's because elections matter that we are seeing them be running a little bit scared, at least on the House, in the Texas House of Representatives, because they know that this is not a popular issue. Mm-hmm. But this was not the same story last legislative session, right? And that's why it's so important.
And, like I say, I have to tiptoe because I really don't want to violate any of the politicizing. But I mean, one of the things I hear all the time is, how all these parties are the same, all the political parties are the same. But you're saying there's partisan divides on these things, and we don't have to go into that. But
there definitely is partisan divides, but there are, some that some that are not as clear cut.
Sure.
But even on let's say on the Texas House of Representatives, we still the Democrats don't have a majority, but because it's much closer, and that the margins were a lot closer than the last election cycle, that they're changing their extremism, right? We still have some extreme numbers, but they're not nearly as extreme because they're scared. They know that this could be their last legislative session if they're not careful, and they do not want to take a vote on some of these anti-LGBTQ bills.
That's good.
Yeah. It works. That's why it's so important to stay engaged.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that Texas Freedom Network is so important, the work you do.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we are engaged throughout the entire process, the electoral cycle. We are students. We're engaging young people on college campuses. Students are advocating with students, right? We want to make sure that it's peer to peer, and we are creating this pipeline of young leaders. Our goal in 5 years is to help elect a Texas Rising. That's our student chapters. Yeah. A Texas Rising student. We want to help them be elected to office. We're trying to we have at the legislature 3 or 4 former Texas Rising students that are working in offices. I'm a Texas Rising grad. Cool. So, trying to create this leadership pipeline so we have this, when you create a pattern of engagement, from the beginning in college, then they're going to stay engaged for the rest of their lives. So that's what we're working on. But it's an uphill battle right now, but we're getting so much closer. We saw that last election cycle. Yeah.
So they had like a kind of controversial first draft of an abortion bill, and that got edited quite heavily. So explain that to me. What was going on?
So there's a lot. So we've seen a shift on anti-LGBTQ bills in some ways. We have not seen that on abortion. That where there's still a lot of anti-abortion, anti-choice legislation. We had, for example, they've gotten almost completely passed, is something called the Born Alive Act, which is completely a messaging tool. It is an attempt to make anybody that votes against it look like they are supporting infanticide, and that is that's not how this works. Again, tapping into fear-mongering and lies. Abortion is one of the safest procedures, and 95% of them, or even more, happen before 12 weeks.
Yeah.
Even less happen before 20 weeks. So the fact that this bill, which says that if a fetus is born alive after an abortion, a doctor has to take life-saving measures. 99% of abortions are performed before viability.
Yeah.
And so, and if there is any child that is alive after an abortion, which doesn't happen, there's no reported cases in the state of Texas, none whatsoever. But a doctor is always going to take life-saving measures on a patient, no matter what. And so it also is insulting to doctors to assume that they're just going to leave any sort of patient there just to die. And it gives the AG immense power to prosecute based off an anonymous tip line. So it is a messaging tool for them to say that doctors aren't doing what they need to be doing, and that abortion is an extremely dangerous procedure. And when we just talked about, it's most of the time just a pill.
Right. So what has been the medical community response to this?
The American College of Gynecologists came out strongly against this bill because it is, in fact, not factually accurate. But
and I see a lot of there've been a lot of pushback from RNs who work in neonatal units saying, "Hey, we are not executing babies here.
Right.
These are babies who are born very, very young, and if the parents want life-saving, extraordinary measures on these children, they will do it. But there are some kids that are born and there's really just, no possibility.
Well,
that
there's
they're
also
survive.
a difference between a premature birth and a child. Like this bill specifically targets children born alive after an attempt at an abortion, which is not
right. That doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And if a child is born premature, then you're right. Like they'll take life-saving measures, but there are some times when there's nothing you can do because
my concern is that you have a woman who decides to continue a pregnancy with a fetus that has no hope of survival, but she wants to continue that pregnancy because that's her choice, right? So she continues the pregnancy. She gives birth to a child that she knows is going to die probably soon after birth. And my concern here is that legislation like this would interfere with her right to make a choice for her child.
That's exactly.
To provide palliative care instead of intrusive medical interventions that will not change
all of these bills interfere with the choice between a woman, her family, and her doctor, right?
Yeah. But we can't make people vaccinate. So I just want to make that clear because that would be overreach.
Yeah.
Overreach.
Yes.
So it's there's a lot. There was I think the bill you're talking about has to do with the capital murder. Is that? Yeah, that's the one that
they tried to run that up the flagpole.
So the chair of that committee tried to make himself look good by saying, "Oh, we're going to give it all a hearing, but anything that attempts to prosecute the woman is not going to make it out of my committee." But he still gave it a hearing, and it was a hearing. It was ugly and disgusting because this is a bill that says that if a woman has an abortion, she could be charged with capital murder. And in Texas, capital murder
is a death penalty.
You can get the death penalty for capital murder. So it literally is would allow women to be put to death for having an abortion. And so it was a very ugly hearing. This committee chair, who tried to make himself look good, also, though, made an intern with one of our partner organizations cry. It was disgusting and despicable, and the fact that this was able to get a hearing and that they gave these people a voice who were calling for the death of women is despicable.
Well, nothing says pro-life like
the death
penalty.
And then when he said afterwards, when he said that he wasn't going to let it out of committee, and he wasn't going to give it a vote, they made death threats to him.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I saw the article on that. It was so interesting that you had somebody who was receiving death threats from the pro-life community for not supporting legislation that would promote the death penalty.
Right.
I mean,
it's
what do you even say?
At some point, you can't say too much because there's no reasoning. It's not reasonable. Having like I said, it's thinking too much about how hypocritical some of these things are just will just drive you insane if you think about it too much, because it is, and there's to some extent no arguing with people who are going to ask for the death penalty for women who.
But what's interesting, though, is when you understand the religious motivation behind it, it makes perfect sense. It's no longer hypocritical. Then it becomes reasonable because you have this idea of they consider this a murder, and if you commit murder, then you should die, right? And this is all in line with their conservative brand of religion. And so they don't see this at all as incongruous.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really concerning, but all of this comes full circle of why why there's separation of church and state, because that brand of religion and any brand of religion should not have impacts on public policy.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I wanted to get back to a little bit about Texas Freedom Network, because Texas Freedom Network does a lot more than just legislation. You guys have been at the forefront of like the State Board of Education fights and stuff like that.
Well, you were featured in Revisionaries.
We did. Yeah. So that was...
Not you personally,
no,
but the group.
TFN. So I think it was right before I started my internship with TFN, actually in college. That was filmed. The Revisionaries is a documentary that was based off the Texas State Board of Education and TFN, and some of the battles on science and social studies that happened
under McElroy.
Under Don McElroy. This was from about 8 years ago or so, and it's I think that thoroughly embarrassed the board, so they have been quieter about their crazy, but they're still pushing really ideological curriculum. It's really despicable that in the state of Texas that anything that is put in textbooks, whether that be, we're about to come up on the sex ed fight this year. Sex ed, for the first time in 20 years, they're redoing the health and sex ed standards. But social studies, science, that there's no statute that says that anything they teach has to go through some sort of review process with experts and scholars. So as a result, they are able to literally put anything they want in there. And that includes, we finally at the 11th hour got them to change this past time that slavery was the primary cause of this, was the cause of the Civil War.
Mention that, right? Because they have inserted slavery back into the textbooks, right? So slave trade now is being put back in.
So it used to, before, up until this year, it was... like slavery was what are the causes of the Civil War?
Well, also the transatlantic triangle trade.
In another section they used that term instead, and then they also listed what were the causes of the Civil War. And first was states' rights and sectionalism, and then it was slavery. So they thought they were going to fix it after they've put work groups together, and we've been actually in the social studies, we were very pleased with the work groups. It was actually just educators, because in the past they've put...
it's like, what, I think three of the board members have to agree on somebody, that makes them experts. right?
Something like that.
Yeah,
There's
they had
nothing.
David Barton, who has
yes.
no degree
in the past.
anything.
Yes, that is
Yeah.
absolutely
was
true.
put up against
actually-
real experts who lost to his ideological perspectives.
Yeah. I mean, one of the board members on an issue that we don't work on, but they cited Nikki Haley as a source for one of their.
Well, Barton wrote a book that was so outrageously
Yeah.
incorrect that even his Christian publisher backed off it.
Right.
And
Yeah, I mean,
then it was Glenn Beck had to go front the money
yeah.
to get the book published.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, because it
Yeah.
did finally get published, but basically the Christian publisher, their statement was, this thing is so off the rails that there's no way to explain this as an ideological interpretation. It's just flat out false.
Well, yeah, I think that some of the experts said that he just flat out made stuff up
Yeah,
in
that's-
that book.
Yeah.
That there was, that literally there was not even a foundation for some of the claims he made in that book. That you
Yeah.
could go back and say, oh, he misinterpreted this letter or whatever. There was nothing.
The board still quotes him, though,
I know.
as their source. Now, this is the board, not the experts,
Yeah.
not the work groups, right? The
Right.
work groups, they redid a lot of, they inserted things that the work groups of educators tried to strike, like that Moses was was
come on.
influential on the founding fathers
like
and like
a-
a founding documents. Like
That's like saying Aesop was,
yeah. So we
Aesop's
Yeah.
Fox and Grapes was a big, had a big impact. Just to give people some context, right? So David Barton is famous for, or infamous, depending on how you see it, for a website called Wall Builders, right? And that's his thing, where he promotes that the United States is a Christian nation and that it should be reflective of Christian values and and supportive of the Christian religion,
right, and
as he understands it.
Yeah, as he understands it, right? He is very, he's well known for amongst the far right, and like is one of their saviors because he writes history based on what he wants it to be, not what it actually was. And then he's used as a source for the State Board of Education when they are trying to insert these standards that are just factually inaccurate. We contacted this social studies teacher. He was a middle school social studies teacher who had his students as part of their curriculum write to the State Board of Education members and tell them why slavery was the cause of the Civil War.
Yeah.
He seems like I would have loved to have him as my history teacher because he told his students, like, all right, this is what it says. It says states' rights, sectionalism, slavery. Like, I want you to do your own research and tell me what was the cause of the Civil War. So they had to come up with themselves, and the only thing they came up with all this evidence for why slavery was the cause of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I remember during the debate, one of the board members said, "Yeah, states' rights to own slaves, so states' rights." I'm like, you just said.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make and we're really concerned because health textbooks are coming up, and they are. The health is sex ed, and sex ed is really, the state of Texas is consistently one of the highest in teen birth rates, number 1 or 2 in repeat teen birth rates, HIV, STI rates. Not to mention, a lot of sex ed is very anti-LGBTQ. They don't mention birth control. So the state of sex ed in Texas is a mess. And so we're about to, in 2019 to the beginning of 2020, they're going to be rewriting those standards. So we're going to be working on those because God forbid that children learn and kids learn about their body and about sex because, therefore you're promoting sex.
It has always been really weird to me. I remember even when I was in school for the biology course that I took, we went through all the, you could go through the respiratory system and the digestive, so you could go through all of that. But when it got to the reproductive system, you had to go bring a note home to get permission to go through this section and the sex ed that was involved in that. And this course is going to include, sex education. And so you had to literally get a note from your parents saying that you were allowed to be in that class. And I remember, it's funny because when I was in school at the time, it didn't really strike me. It struck me that the instructor was stressing it, but I didn't understand why. And now as an adult looking back on it, I understand what they were saying. And what the instructor said, what our teacher said in the high school classroom was, I have a curriculum that I have to stick to, but if anybody has questions, please feel free to ask because I am allowed to answer anything.
Oh, okay.
And so what I understand now, what she was doing was basically saying that she was restricted to strictly stick to this curriculum, but that
She was
if
trying
you asked
to get
her,
around it. Yeah.
But the thing is, it was like at that time, nobody was going to say, I wasn't going to, I'm not trans, but like I wouldn't have raised my hand and said, I think I might be a guy. Right, like no one's gonna, and is that a normal thing, or is there something wrong with me, or nobody. There are questions people aren't going to ask because people still get ostracized and bullied for particular things. So even for the teacher to say you can ask, there are kids who aren't going to ask that openly in a class.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and we see, so in the state of Texas, the way it works is that sex ed, whether they teach it or not, they don't have to teach that sex ed is not required, and it doesn't have to be medically accurate, peer reviewed. But that does
it doesn't have to be medically accurate.
It does not,
which is absurd.
It's absurd.
I don't even know what that. Like, why would you even? Why? I don't even.
So that's an attempt to teach abstinence only, far right, like sex is bad. If you have sex, you're going to hell, kind of.
No.
Kind of sex ed.
Until you get married. No. And then they have entire blogs where people tell married Christian couples, you're supposed to be having sex.
Right.
Lots of sex all the time. Your marriage needs this. Wives, you have no right to refuse your husband.
That's right.
And
so I mean, every year we try to pass a bill that just says, "Hey, if you teach sex ed, it has to be medically accurate, peer reviewed."
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't ever get a hearing.
How is that controversial? That is so unbelievable.
Because that would not allow them to teach fear mongering. It would not allow them to teach. For example, I had a friend, and this is a very common type of story. I had a friend who went to when she was in high school. Had sex ed where they had a big class and they asked for 5 male volunteers, 1 female volunteer. She got up and was the female volunteer. The guys stood in a line at the front. She stood and they gave her a paper heart and she went down the line, and the men tore off a little piece of the heart as she went down the line, and they told her, for every time you have sex before you're married, you lose a little piece of your heart. And like they wouldn't be able to teach that because that's not.
Yeah, because it's crap.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is I was listening to NPR on the way over here, and they actually is this show that's on there called Wait, Don't Tell Me. They do these they'll talk about something and then people have to guess. What are they talking about? And they said, so there's this thing that classrooms have been doing, and they're using a rose and a piece of tape and a piece of gum. And they said, what is it that they're doing? And the person that was guessing didn't know what it was, and so they just said, teaching students what it's like when your education budget gets cut. Right? So it was kind of funny. But the reality was, I was surprised that it was sex ed in abstinence-only classrooms. And I was thinking, okay, I'm very curious. So apparently they put the tape on somebody and then they take it off them, and then they put the tape on the next person and they say, see, it doesn't stick as well anymore. Like it doesn't work as well because it's just, because when you use it on all these people, like it doesn't work as well. And it's like, I'm thinking to myself, I got news. I could put it on my arm and take it off and put it on another place on my arm and take it off, and it wouldn't work as well on me, right? So if your goal is to demonstrate that sex with a single partner is somehow better, it still doesn't work, right?
Yeah, that metaphor. Yeah.
I mean, obviously the gum too would be like, that's pretty gross, but it's like, yeah, I guess you could save gum like as a kid I used to, but the rose, they did what you were talking about. They handed it around to the class, and they said that, by the end of it, of course, the rose doesn't look as nice as it did when it first started.
Oh, I thought they were taking petals off of it.
No, maybe they did, right? Yeah. But they were just, this was
giving
what I was hearing on NPR. Somebody laughed and said, and then there's that poor kid in the corner who never got to touch the rose. Yeah. He's like, am I ever going to get a rose? Right? And but one of the things it reminded me of is what Jen always says, which is, sex is one of the few things in life where we literally denigrate experience.
Yeah.
Literally, in everything else, we are able to recognize that you actually get better and you improve as you practice and you do things and you try things and you experiment with something. You become a better driver the more you drive. You don't become a worse driver. It's not like, oh, after the first time you drive, you're never going to drive as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and
nobody will want to ride the car with you anymore.
Studies have shown that kids who learn about sex ed and are comfortable talking about it and aren't nearly as curious about it, actually delay having sex because it's not like, what is this? I'm afraid to say no. Like as a woman, you know, if you're taught that all of these things, but then you don't know how to say no, you think that you're supposed to do it for the pleasure of your partner.
Right.
And instead of just teaching kids to have ownership of their bodies, and if you want to, great. Here's how to be safe.
Yeah.
If you don't want to, then don't. You don't have to.
Right.
And it also, so if you kids that we're not teaching sex ed aren't not having sex, they're still having sex.
Right.
So we owe it to our kids to teach them and give them this information so they can make the choices that are best for them.
Well, and my point is that, so I have a 13-year-old son, so, you know, this...
Relevant.
Yes, we have these conversations, okay? He's had his own supply of condoms for a while.
Yeah.
Not because he's having sex, but because the first time he has sex, I want him to already know how to use a condom.
Yeah.
And so the way to do that is make sure he has them, and, you know, he can ask me if he needs more to practice.
Right.
Or I just assume that he needs more and just give him some more.
Just because you want fresh ones.
Because I don't.
They do expire. You gotta.
Yeah. And I don't want, you know, him to worry that, oh, hey, you know, I need to go ask my mom to get me some more condoms because, you know, I practiced on all the ones I had. I don't want him to be weird about that or anything. So I just give them to him and he does whatever he does with them, and that's not my business.
Right.
But, you know, whether kids that have accurate information about sexual health, whether they have more sex or less sex or no sex or all the sex or whatever, I don't care about that. What I care about is that they make good decisions when they're in that moment.
Right.
And they have the information they need to do that. And so, you know, for me, as the parent of a son, we're having a lot of conversations around consent.
Right.
And we're having a lot of conversations about condoms.
Right.
You know, and those are the things I want him to know about before he goes into that. And also about, you know, what the girls in his class are going through. Because one of the things I remember when I was in middle school, our sex ed classes were sex segregated. And I get that you might want to do that for middle school kids. But when they put us in these sex segregated classes, they only taught the girls about female anatomy and what we were going through in puberty. And they only taught the boys about male anatomy and what they were going through in puberty. They didn't teach, you know, boys about girls and girls about boys. And so there was still all this mystery and mythology going around about the other sex. And I think that, you know...
Well, and that also promotes, like, normative views, right?
That's right, yeah. Well, and it's, you know, without... I didn't get sex ed at all, which... is sad that that's actually better than people who got abstinence only sex ed, because I was not at least indoctrinated with like these
weird
some of these weird ideas.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it wasn't there. It was still not. It was still mysterious, and like you're still through society get these views that sex is supposed to be more pleasurable for the man than it is for the woman, right? And consent, and part of comprehensive sex ed is consent, and that's so crucial to as these boys are becoming men and going to college. We have to have this consent conversation, and we can't have the consent conversation without talking open and honestly about sex and sex ed and.
Right, and how people respond and react, and how, not saying anything shouldn't be taken as agreement or consent.
And you don't owe anybody anything, and nobody owes you anything, right?
Well, and that consent thing is so important. And I think I mentioned this on an episode of the Atheist Experience about a month or so ago, but I was having a conversation with my son about consent. And I was asking him, so if you have a girlfriend and you've had sex with her before and she gets drunk at a party and passes out, is it okay to have sex with her, again? And he's like, no. And I said, well, you've had sex before. She said yes before. Why not? And he's like, well, she's passed out. You can't have sex with somebody that's passed out. And I said, so is it because she can't say no? And he's like, no, Mom, it's because she can't say yes. And so it's like, okay, he gets it.
Yeah, that's really great.
You don't, 13 years old, and this kid understands more about consent than a lot of adult men do.
That's right.
And that's my thing. I really feel like the no means no mantra can't die fast enough because it literally means that you've already violated somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a yes means yes.
Right.
And that's what it needs to be.
That's right. So, I mean, keep an eye out because that's coming this year. I mean, we had, and the conversation has already started at the legislature. I mean, there was a public hearing about some transparency around sex ed decisions at the local level because they're all made at the local level. So I encourage anybody to get involved at the local level when it comes to sex ed. AISD has a great program, though. But a senator, a current senator, made a comment that Planned Parenthood is in the sex ed business so they can increase their abortion pipeline.
What?
And you saw all the jaws drop in the room, but these are the people that are making public policy, and it's absurd to think that.
Well, because, when Colorado implemented their, free contraception for, teens and everything, oh, that's right. Their teen birth rate dropped. The abortion rate dropped. Oh my gosh.
Well, I mean,
but talk about the separation of lack of separation of church and state. It is the far right religion that is guiding these policies and this fear mongering around sex.
And it is just like a flat denial of reality and a flat denial of what humanity is. And this is, just to kind of skip it back a little bit, it's like when you can't accept that human beings are an evolved species, that we are a social species, that we are a social sexual species, when you reject that and you say that what is normal and natural for a human being, what a human being actually is, like the innate nature of a human being, is not what it should be.
Right.
And that's a flawed, fallen, mistaken. It's a mistake of, instead of just saying it is what it is, and I'm not even saying it is what it should be because I don't think there is a should be. I'm just saying humans are what humans are. Right. And that's what you're confronted with. And that's, if you have a solution, it has to work within an understanding of human beings being what human beings are.
Right.
It can't work with a solution of here's what human beings should be.
Right.
And they're not. And so we're going to punish them every time they're not what I think they should be, right? And this is what they're doing because their solutions are all solutions to punish people for sex, not to really mitigate the risks and the problems that happen, because that would mean acknowledging that people are people. Right.
Yeah, it's a lack of living in reality, right? And putting your beliefs on somebody else. That we shouldn't be doing these things. We shouldn't be having sex before we're married. And then and if you do, then it's sinful. And we can't talk about it in a public space because that would mean promoting it instead of just dealing with the reality that this is how humans exist. This is what teenagers do, and it's not bad. It's not sinful, and it would be a disservice to pretend that it's not happening.
It would almost be like suggesting that in order to keep from saying hurtful things to people, no one should ever speak.
Yeah.
And when someone speaks, we punish them harshly, right? And we say, hey, you're not going to die by abstaining from speaking. It's not going to kill you to abstain from speaking. We're social animals and we communicate, and human beings all over the planet have language. To tell a human being the solution is that no one can ever speak is just an untenable, unrealistic, and it's like, it's not because people cannot not speak. I could walk around and never speak again, but that's not that'd be denying an innate reality of what a human being is demonstrably like.
Yeah.
And so to say that, people, she should just keep her legs closed. And it's like, you know what? You don't understand humanity. You don't understand what people are. You don't understand what human beings are. And really, you're just not up to competency to have this conversation.
Right. Well, it does a huge disservice. It puts the blame on women, but I would think, it also says that men can't control themselves, which I think is also really insulting to men, right? Yeah. The fact that they are just these animals who aren't intelligent enough, right, to control themselves. Like it puts all the onus on the woman and insults men.
And this kind of gets back to the sex ed thing, because people who make this comment that, well, if she has sex, then she's consenting to a pregnancy. She knew she could get pregnant. There was this risk. And it's like, okay, that's one of the reasons we need more and better sex education. Because a woman is only fertile for about 2 days out of the month. 1/15 of my time out there, I might be able to conceive. You know, and I mean, this idea that, you know, you should never have sex for the other 28 days of the month because those 2 days, and we can figure out when those 2 days are.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's this lack of information.
But the thing is, even when we know pretty much when those 2 days are, there's still a possibility.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And that's how unintended pregnancies happen. And that's why we need to have better information so we can assess the risk. Yeah. But this idea that you're blaming women for having sex, you know, when she knows she's only fertile 2 days out of the month.
Yeah.
And, oh crap, I mistook which day it was, you know, or whatever. I mean,
yeah, and
instead
instead we see the far right try to decrease access to healthcare, decrease access to information in sex ed. They're attempting to shut down clinics, even healthcare clinics.
Yeah.
Bring it back to the legislature. There's another bill I wanted to flag, Senate Bill 22, House Bill 1929, that would it's a preemption bill, but it would bar municipalities from contracting with any healthcare facilities that have anything to do with abortions. It's specifically targeting the Planned Parenthood on East 7th Street here in Austin.
Yeah.
Because the city of Austin is renting the land to them basically for nothing. That is a healthcare facility. It doesn't. That one particular doesn't provide abortions, but even if it did, so what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That facility's been there for a long time when that was historically an underserved, low-income neighborhood, and they are trying to shut down that and stop any other municipal governments in the state of Texas from providing health care to their communities. We know Planned Parenthood and other clinics go into these communities to provide vital services,
right?
And that they wouldn't be able to do that without contracting and working with their local governments. And so this bill would stop them from doing that, and that's just another way that they're trying to defund Planned Parenthood.
Meanwhile, the state is funding these crisis pregnancy centers, which
yes.
provide no health care to women.
Oh man, yeah.
And they are sucking up resources that should be used.
And another point of hypocrisy, right?
They get a lot of state funding
Yes,
too.
they do.
If you're an abortion provider, you have to provide information, right, on other alternatives.
Right.
But if you're a crisis pregnancy center, you're not required to provide information on full range of services.
That's correct.
So it's like if you're the person pimping the incorrect information or the limited or the what is it, the half-truth information.
Right. Yeah.
You don't have to tell the full truth.
They are literally deceiving women. They're delaying. The woman comes in pregnant. They delay her appointment till it's too late to have an abortion.
Right.
They fearmonger. They scare them into trying to convince them not to have an abortion. Which is so deceiving, and they receive state funds for this. There was just a bill on that.
That's disturbing.
There was a bill on the Senate floor yesterday. I think it was, or maybe it was Thursday. That currently, they, like you mentioned, they are required to give certain information to women who are seeking abortions. Most of that information is completely false. But the state requires it. This would go even further because they can give the information to the woman. The woman doesn't have to look at it, right? So this would require
counseling, right?
A third-party counselor.
Who doesn't have to be licensed.
So, AKA like a crisis pregnancy center counselor to come in to counsel a woman who's trying to have an abortion through a legitimate abortion clinic before she is able to receive that abortion.
So my question to these legislators is, are they requiring this same level of counseling for people who want a total knee replacement? Because the dissatisfaction rate with total knee replacements is far higher than that of abortion. There many more people regret having a TKR versus having an abortion.
Well, and many abortion clinics, like we with one of our partners, we did a walkthrough. We did they walked us through the clinic so we could see how it works. They counsel already, but they counsel in a non-judgmental, like tell me how you're feeling about this, and kind of way to make sure that
you're not coerced.
They're not coerced, but even if a lot of women do struggle with they know they want this abortion, but their religion has told them it's wrong. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's
Right.
work through that, like in a non-judgmental way. And and also though, if a woman says she doesn't want to have the
Right.
abortion, they will say, okay, well maybe this isn't right for you, or you know what, here, let's help you work through your fears of what your religion has told you. That already happens because it's a compassionate place, and having them then also have to have a counselor that would fearmonger and tell them you can't do this would be devastating.
Well, and I think another thing that's important to note is that there's really not a financial incentive for clinics to perform extra abortions. I mean, one of the things about the abortion legislation is that it's made it so difficult for women to access these services that organizations like Planned Parenthood and other organizations that provide abortion, they've gone to great lengths to keep the cost of the procedure down as low as possible. So there's really not a profit margin there. It's basically as low as they can get it and still provide good medical care.
Right. Yeah. And even the few $100s that it costs, a lot of women can't afford that.
Right.
So that's why you have, funds.
I was going to say, is this a good time to promote Lilith Fund or,
Yeah,
any of those?
yeah.
Yeah, there's several. There's a few. There's Lilith. There's T Fund. There's a few. I know I'm Frontera Fund that help provide provide income to women for their abortions, because we have so many laws in place in this state and barriers that it takes more than one day.
Right.
You have
Multiple
to
visits.
drive a lot farther, multiple visits, and lose. So therefore, there's a lot of the times lost wages. What are you going to do with childcare? Because a lot of women who have abortions already have children.
Right.
And so there's all these barriers that we're putting in place. And you know what? If I am privileged enough that if I ever need to have an abortion, I can find a way to have one.
Right.
Because I
Right.
could travel for one.
Right.
And the way the state of Texas works, the barriers that we have in place, access to abortion is already not a reality for a lot of women because of the financial and time barriers that are in place. And that's why we need to work hard. I hope that we will continue to increase access and increase awareness and change the narrative around this, because the reality is, there's a lot of women who already, they can't access it.
Yeah, and it's another one of those situations where the hypocrisy starts to make sense when you understand the underlying ideology, right? So when sex is wrong, and pregnancy is one of those risks that also works as a punishment, as a natural punishment, like an STD, then you actually don't want to mitigate those things, right? Because those are the punishments put in place for doing the wrong thing, right? So you had sex, you got an STD. This is why we told you not to have sex.
Right.
You had sex, you got pregnant. This is why we told you not to get pregnant. So when people say, not to have sex. And so when people say, well, it makes no sense that they claim to be about, saving these babies, but then once the baby's born, they don't seem to want to do anything. It's like, no, it makes perfect sense because the baby is supposed to be a punishment.
Right. That's
and
right.
the other thing is, or you give the baby away, which in my mind is, that then they get to take it to the Christian home because they got the law saying that you don't have to adopt it out to a Catholic or a gay couple. So we're gonna take the baby away, put it in a Christian home, and then you get to grow up knowing that your baby was given away and raised by strangers.
Right.
And so the whole narrative is you shouldn't be having sex, and if you end up pregnant because of sex, that's not our fault. You shouldn't have sinned.
Yeah.
And you have to now it's your responsibility to
deal with it.
To deal with it.
Yeah. Oh, and after you give the baby up for adoption and wonder for the rest of your life what
if it
happened
was
to that
abused
child,
or if it,
you also still get to bear the burden of being ruined because you had a child out of wedlock.
like the narrative.
Yeah.
And we are
we're
hitting a little bit past the hour, but I think we started a little bit past the hour, so I think that's all right.
So,
you had volunteered to do our outro in the absence of
Yeah.
Claire. Let
Before
me
we-
thank.
Before we do that, I want to make sure everybody has the website address. It's tfn.org.
That's correct.
Oh, thank you.
So,
Yes.
you.
make sure you go and check them out. They are a one-of-a-kind organization, exists here only in Texas, was started by Cecile Richards.
It was started by
who
Cecile
just started
Richards.
Supermajority, which you should check out as well.
Oh, yes. Supermajority. I've been posting about that.
Yeah, so
Really awesome. Women in activism.
Yeah,
Yes.
keep an eye out. Well, there'll be lots of opportunities to engage for the last few weeks of legislative session. And then this, like I said, this year, health and sex ed is up in the State Board of Education. So we'll definitely need help mobilizing for that.
All right. Well, thank you to Carisa Lopez.
Thanks for
coming
having me.
out and representing.
This was so much fun.
Oh, well, anytime. I mean, we welcome your participation. So feel free.
Thank
If you've got
you.
something going on and you want to reach out to us to help promote it, we're happy to have you
I
on.
appreciate that.
Okay.
all right.
I'm good.
And with that, thank you for joining Godless Bitches. And remember, we don't need a savior. We have each other. It's all we've ever had and all we'll ever need. Thanks.